Hi Bio30, welcome to 13.1 video lesson on the introduction to the endocrine system and what that is. So we start with homeostasis as we did in the nervous system, realizing that not only does the brain and the nervous system help with homeostasis, controlling all our organs, but the endocrine system also has that function and does that using hormones to keep the body in a constant state despite the environment. And when, if you think of the brain as the control center, when it senses something is off, too high or too low amount of something in the body, the brain will respond by balancing that. And in this chapter, we'll look at how that balance is carried out by using hormones. So this was just an example of all the things that the body can do in response to exercise. There is temperature control to cool the body down by basically creating sweating or perspiration that evaporates and cools down as that happens. And water balance, if you're losing water for that, then we've got to balance water and keep more water with the kidneys and dilate our blood vessels so they can move to the surface of the skin and cool off. So this was an example of a homeostatic response. So one of the diagrams here of where the endocrine system is, it's basically all the glands in the body that produce hormones. We have mentioned that there's a pituitary gland in the brain. We have mentioned that the hypothalamus is in control of that gland. Those are two that we will talk about a lot. We've got the thyroid gland that is wrapped around your trachea just below the larynx. And behind the thyroid gland is little dots that are parathyroid, so we'll hear about those. Thymus in the chest has a immune system function. Not really going to talk about that one too much. Adrenals are popped on top of your kidneys right there, so we'll talk about those. There is an outer and an inner adrenal area that releases different hormones. The pancreas, we talked about it before in digestion because of the enzymes made there. However, it also is a gland and has a glandular function to make insulin and glucagon, so it will make hormones as well as digestive enzymes. And then testes and ovaries, we'll talk about hormones that are made in the testes and ovaries in its own chapter in chapter 14. So for this chapter, you just have to know that they are part of the endocrine system, but we'll go into that later. So the comparison here, we've mentioned before that the nervous system sends its messages precisely to a certain other body structure and uses neurotransmitters, whereas the endocrine system, which takes a bit longer to get its message there using hormones traveling through the blood, is something that can have a much longer lasting effect. So you may start for example, adrenaline response with the nervous system having a quick response and that adrenaline will do, but then the endocrine system will take over and keep those same effects like heart beating and blood sugar up for a longer period of time. So there's both involved. I want to look at this diagram with you that just makes you kind of look at how the endocrine glands will release hormones, and they will be the green ones here. So there's endocrine cells that will release the hormones into the blood. That's how they're carried. And if the cells that it passes don't have receptors for them, they will keep trucking by. However, if they do get to their target cells that they're trying to affect, those will have receptors for those hormones, and the hormones will cause some response in those cells. So hormones are specific. They are going to specific other locations in the body and causing some effect. So I want to mention what endocrine glands are compared to exocrine. Our chapter is on endocrine glands, which is about hormones that move through the blood, but exocrine are glands that release some product, not hormones, but some product that goes into a duct or a cavity. So when you hear the word sweat gland or mammary gland or salivary gland or tear gland or pancreatic gland, those are not hormonal in structure or function. They are just releasing something into a duct. Okay, this is another picture just to show you, this is a piece of the pancreas that does make hormones, and it just shows you that as blood is flowing through that area, the hormones made in the glandular cells of the pancreas, those hormones will pop into the blood and the blood will flow away carrying those hormones, and they'll head to other parts of the body where they are going to target some response in some other tissue. Your diagram to label in your notes on page 3, page 4 is this one that came from your textbook. It is one that it talks about the pineal gland here, which is not going to be in your tests, but it's about helping with your sleep-wake cycle. We will talk a lot about the homeostasis controlled by the hypothalamus, controlling the pituitary. I'll talk about the thyroid and the parathyroids, thymus a little bit. Not too much talk about that. There's the adrenals glands again on top of the kidneys, and testes and ovaries, and the pancreas. So same kind of diagram. So you've seen it twice. All right, so looking at page 438, you can check this out about historically how the endocrine glands were studied. Basically, they would have to be removing some gland and seeing what the effect is. So the example in the book is how testes were cut off a rooster, and they checked out afterwards how that rooster changed in behavior, and basically he didn't mate or fight or crow or grow any more big feathers. So they sort of knew then that the testes and the hormones in them were responsible for all of those functions. Now, the reason this kind of process is limited is because hormones are complicated. Sometimes many hormones do a similar job. Sometimes they're not released at all times, so they may be there, maybe not there. It depends if they are needed at that time. Some hormones can compensate for each other because several can do the same job, and some work together, so it's a complicated thing to do this method. So current techniques now is more about microscopy and staining those hormones and watching their where they come from and where they go with that technology. Okay, so in terms of the action of hormones, they will basically be released and bind to a specific protein receptor on another cell. So in this diagram, this would be an endocrine cell from an endocrine gland. The hormone would be the little, the blue molecule here, and the hormone again flows through the blood, passes by cells that don't have receptors, but will attach to cells that do have receptors for that particular hormone, and they will affect that cell and trigger some reaction. There are two kinds of hormones. There are just chemical structure-wise. There's the steroid hormones that are lipid in structure, and so if they're made of lipids, they will also be soluble in lipids and be able to slide right into a lipid cell membrane. And a lot of our sex hormones are those types, lipid steroid hormones. So basically those hormones can slide into the cell directly and initiate some response. Second type of hormone would be the protein hormones that are made of proteins or groups of amino acids. So they are not water soluble, so they would have to actually be able to attach to a receptor right on the surface of a target cell. And basically most of our hormones are protein hormones in structure, and you just have to be aware that there are two types and how they either attach to the receptor in the case of protein or slide right in the case of lipid hormones. For hormone regulation, we will be talking about feedback loops for this chapter a lot, and you will want to make a collection of, it's probably around a dozen feedback loops that make up the content of this chapter. So you can record those as we go through chapter 13, either on flashcards or on a separate piece of paper where you collect them all, because that will be the major content that you have to know for the assessments. But they will be similar in the way that most of them will start being regulated and triggered by a message that the hypothalamus gets and needs to maintain homeostasis in some way. So the hypothalamus will release some kind of a releasing hormone to the pituitary in many cases, and the pituitary will then release whichever hormone is appropriate or needed, and whichever hormone this is needed, it'll affect some target gland when it gets to it in the blood, and that gland will release another hormone. So as you can see, often there's 3 hormones involved in one necessary response that the body needs to make. And that's going to happen if, for example, this hormone is low in the blood. That message will cause the sequence of events. But when there's enough of this hormone, so when the job is done, it will cause a negative feedback response. So it'll stop both brain parts with this negative sign is put on these arrows. It'll stop the brain parts, the hypothalamus and pituitary, from continuing this pathway. So we have the brain, whatever stimulus it is responding to, it'll cause this sequence of events, but then there'll be a negative feedback, and like we actually write a negative sign on this to stop it when the job is done. So that's basically what pretty much most of the coming up feedback loops will be structured like. This is just one little example from your book talking about the stimulus of dehydration or low blood pressure, low blood volume, and how that will cause the antidiuretic hormone release. And basically we've got the hypothalamus here, the pituitary here, and ADH is going to be released by the pituitary and cause 2 things to happen. Because we're dehydrated, it's going to cause water reabsorption, and over here it's going to cause vasoconstriction, which is constricting our blood vessels to help with the low blood pressure. So it's just showing you the 2 effects that would happen with ADH, and if those 2 jobs are done, there is the negative feedback here that will happen, and that's the message that's sent back to the brain. Basically, both of these brain parts is what I should have been. My feedback loops look a little bit different than this, but it is the hypothalamus and the pituitary that get that negative feedback message to stop once the job is done, and once we have hydrated enough and increased our blood volume and pressure enough. So that is one little example. This picture here was put in just for you to practice how to put in your negative feedback arrows. So we've got the hypothalamus. For example, we'll be talking about this particular feedback loop later, but the hypothalamus sends out a releasing hormone to the pituitary. Pituitary sends out this hormone, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which targets the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland sends out the hormone cortisol. All of this is stress response for this example, and you'll hear about it in 13.3. But the point of this was for you to practice. If this is a sample feedback loop, we always complete it by putting in the negative feedback arrows. And when the job is done, the hypothalamus gets the message to stop, and the pituitary gland gets the message to stop. So we put the little arrows and negative signs going back to both parts of the brain, and that's a completed feedback loop. And you had this to practice by popping those arrows in your notes on page 6. So you can just draw those in. And similarly, this was the second one, and my arrows are already in here. So you can see that in this case, we're talking about thyroid hormones. When those thyroid hormones are released in sufficient amounts, then we have, again, these negative feedback arrows with a negative sign telling both the hypothalamus and pituitary they can stop releasing hormones because the job is done. Just to wrap up our first topic here, on page 6, there is a look at the pituitary gland and how it's got a front anterior section, anterior lobe, and it's got a back to the pituitary gland called the posterior lobe. And we're just looking at how there are many hormones found in that that pituitary, and these will be topics covered, hormones that are covered in the rest of our chapter. But we just start here by taking a look at what those hormones are in the back here in the posterior pituitary. You guys can label these in your notes, but just in short form, for example, letter A is the ADH that comes from the posterior pituitary affecting kidneys, the kidney tubules, and B and C are both oxytocin that will affect milk letdown in the mammaries as well as muscle contraction, for example, during childbirth. So what you can do if you want to stop the video here is go and find this diagram on page 445 in your textbook and put in the abbreviations of all of the other hormones that come out of the anterior pituitary now. If you'd like to see my answer immediately, we will just take a look at my answer key on this next slide, but you can also find them for yourself. I highlighted the posterior pituitary for the picture on the left, and I wrote in the jobs as well. So ADH helps to keep water by affecting the kidney tubules, and we're talking about the tubules of the nephron. And oxytocin will help with milk letdown of the mammaries and uterine contractions. So that's the two hormones in the posterior. For the anterior lobe here, you can zoom in on this. Letter E is ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone, that affects, I shaded it in yellow, affects just the cortex of the adrenal gland. And it will cause these two hormones to be released, cortisol and aldosterone. And remember, I just drew a kidney in here because that adrenal gland is sitting on top of the kidney. So just showing where it's located. Next hormone from the anterior pituitary, letter F, is thyroid stimulating hormone that affects the thyroid gland. And I drew the trachea here just so you can see, and also a little L is larynx, see where that thyroid gland is located. And the thyroid stimulating hormone makes the thyroid make thyroxine, and that is for increasing metabolism. All of these are, like I said, this is an overview. It's topics are all coming up later. F and H are for LH and FSH. Those are two hormones that will affect the ovaries, and these same two hormones will affect the testes in males and have functions including creating or developing sex cells, so gametes like sperm and egg cells, and also producing sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen, progesterone. So this here will actually be a chapter 14 topic of what happens with the sex hormones. Letter I, prolactin, PRL, is affecting the mammary glands, but for a different function, and that is for milk production. So prolactin is for milk production. Over here, oxytocin was for uterine contractions. It's a muscle contractor, whereas prolactin is for milk production. And the last one, human growth hormone, HGH, is of course for affecting cells in helping them grow. So this is our overview of all of the, many of the glands and hormones. Particularly, this was just the pituitary ones. Making a list here of the posterior pituitary and the two hormones, and make yourself a list of the anterior pituitary and the list of 6 hormones it releases would be a good way to summarize the pituitary, and we will continue on that in 13.2 coming up. And to complete 13.1, the review pages can be done page 7 and 8, and check in on Brightspace for those answers. Bye for now, and we'll see you on 13.2.